Today, it's a cornfield. But more than 50 years ago, this 450-acre plot of land in southern Prince George's County was a field of dreams for a group of young pilots who wanted to reach for the skies. They called themselves the Cloud Club. Frustrated by the hostility they faced at established airports in the nation's capital, they determined that if they wanted to learn how to fly and fix airplanes, they needed their own airport. And by establishing what some say was the only airport owned and operated by African Americans in the United States, they've written themselves into a chapter of aviation history. In the decades following the Civil War, racism and Jim Crow laws kept many African Americans from gaining ground socially and economically. History tells countless stories of challenges African Americans endured to get the training to prepare for professions in medicine, business, and the creative arts. It was even tougher to pursue a passion in a field as elite as aviation.
Black pilots had a difficult time in this area prior to World War II. At most of the airports around here, you were not welcome. They didn't want to rent you airplanes and didn't want to teach you to fly at these airports. They said, we don't teach black folks to fly here.
Just like that?
Yeah. They didn't hold back. They just tell you they didn't do it. See? And of course, you just can't put the blame on aviation. This was the way our society was, period, at that time.
During the World War II years, there was a greater demand for airplane pilots and mechanics, but African Americans were the only group explicitly barred from many sectors of aviation, a practice some based on junk science.
There was a 1925 study by the Army Air Corps which said that blacks lacked the aptitude to fly, and this was the pseudo-scientific basis for excluding them from entrance in the Army Air Corps.
So if you were black and wanted to fly, you had to find a way around those barriers.
C. Alfred Anderson, who you can see here, in order for him to get his pilot's license, he went out, saved his money, went out and bought a plane and then hired a World War I aviator to teach him how to fly. Couldn't get in an aeronautical school.
William Powell, a pilot, engineer, and veteran, worked to pave the way for African Americans in the industry. In 1934, he published the book Black Wings, a story loosely based on his own life that encouraged blacks to pursue aviation.
He believed that blacks in the 1920s and 30s had a unique opportunity to get on the ground floor, as he described it, to learn how to be pilots and mechanics, and he believed, in a very optimistic way, that this would have efficacy for American culture and society.
No doubt Powell inspired the young pilots of Washington, D.C. In the spring of 1940, they formed the Cloud Club. They tried to operate out of established airfields, but due to racial tension of the times, they soon realized they couldn't maintain a business relationship with the owners of those airfields.
When you flew in those days, in the Depression years, you never knew what kind of reception you would get when you landed at a field, whether they would even refuel your aircraft.
We had a Stetson, which is a big 5-place airplane, and we were coming back from West Virginia. And we were low on fuel, so we decided to land at an airport called Bayless Crossroads, which no longer exists today. Mm-hmm. So we landed at Bayless Crossroads, and it had been raining, and the field was kind of wet. And the airport manager came out there raising canes, telling us to get off of the airport, because not simply because the airport was wet, was because we were black folks, and they were not used to seeing black people flying airplanes. See.
So in 1941, the club began searching for its own field, and after an exhaustive search, came upon a potato farm along the Patuxent River.
And that was owned by a lady that lived on the eastern shore by the name of Rebecca Fisher. And she leased this site to these people for $50 a month. They in turn went down and they cut out 2 or 3 runways.
The club named the place Riverside Field, and they convinced John W. Green, a Boston pilot, to relocate to Washington, D.C. to serve as an instructor. Green was the first black man in the country to earn an airplane engine mechanics license and the second to receive a pilot's license. He became airport manager and also began teaching at Phelps Vocational School.
I can tell you a lot about John Green. John Green and I used to go horseback riding every Sunday morning, okay? After Sunday morning, we would go home, change clothes, and get in clothes to come here to go to work. So I would tell him it's time to go to work. He says, yeah, it's time for you to go to work. Time for me to go to work. That's what he was telling me. And I came down here and I cut grass as long as you could see this field. And it was beautiful. It was truly beautiful.
The club built 2 hangars, and with the support of Corey Gill, Green's financial partner and a physician at Howard University Hospital, they began investing in aircraft.
We had the Piper Cubs, we had the Aeroncas, we had the Taylorcraft, Stearman, the BT-13s, and one fellow down here had an AT-6, which was a surplus airplane. And we also had a Stetson down here. Also, the Stetson was a a 4-place airplane with a radial engine, and it had a radial engine, and it was a very popular airplane at that time.
The club held shows at the airfield. They also offered classes for anyone who wanted to fly. One of those people happened to be Gladys Otey, a young woman from Missouri who moved to Washington, D.C. to live with her sister and to take a job with the Census Bureau.
And of course, I just loved that to death. Being able to go up there and then come back down and land. I don't know. I never had an accident. I can't remember any. I go up, I did exactly what they told me to do, and just how they told me to do it, and it worked.
In addition to ground school, the airport offered related courses in meteorology, navigation, and theory of flight. The airfield didn't go unnoticed. It wasn't long before the U.S. Navy decided to take over the well-maintained and ideally located facility for their use during World War II.
And they had a base down in Patuxent. And so what they did, they were doing a lot of training down there, and they used to use this field here as an auxiliary landing strip in conjunction with the training that they were doing down there.
In the lead up to World War II, there was a great push to bring African Americans into military aviation.
This was a real important target in civil rights, because if you could get into that elite company of military aviation, this would give blacks a platform to perform. Very, very important. And one of the, with any kind of social change, sometimes you need patrons. And one important person was Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady, who visited the newly opened Tuskegee Army Airfield and gave all kinds of support for this growing clamor. So in 1941, this base opens up, and they begin to train blacks to become licensed military pilots.
Tuskegee Airman Billy Fauntleroy left school at 16 to work for the U.S. Patent Office, and there he met Herb Jones, one of those young pilots.
He's the first black person I met who had anything to do with flying. And he had in his backyard a BT-13. I thought that was the most amazing thing that could happen to a young boy. I was 16 when I went to work. But that's when I got my interest. When I turned 17 and realized I was going to go into service, I talked to my mother. I said, Ma, I don't want to go in the Navy. I want to go in the Army Air Corps to fly.
A year later, Fauntleroy joined the Army Air Corps Reserves. He went to Tuskegee Army Airfield for training under C. Alfred Anderson.
I soloed after only 8 hours of instruction. And I was the first in my class to solo. And I felt pretty good about that, because I was the little guy. The baby soldier was my nickname. And I was the little guy that they would tease because I was so small. And I was able to take the first 20-hour check, and I took it with C. Alfred Anderson, Chief Anderson.
At the end of World War II, the Navy returned Riverside Field to civilian use. Green renamed the field Columbia Air Center and spent the next decade buying surplus airplanes from the U.S. Navy, adding runways to the airport, as well as offering horseback riding and motorcycle races at the site. But flying was the main attraction. Green retired as airport manager in 1954, but remained a leader in aviation education in the D.C. area. The club maintained Columbia Air Center through 1958. They also volunteered for the Civil Air Patrol.
You know, a lot of times people fly airplanes and they fly in certain areas. If something happens there, it's hard to locate them. And this is what CAP did. They used to be the search arm for the Air Force.
And then I found out about Civil Air Patrol. Most people never hear talk about Civil Air Patrol, and started around the Second World War. And they had a cadet program which took young people from ages 12 through 22. And I joined Civil Air Patrol as a cadet, and that's how I learned about the actual flying of airplanes.
During the whole time that we had the operation down here, we never had a fatality. We had a few accidents, but never a fatality. And that is something that we contribute to John Green, because John Green insisted that people do things according to do things safely.
As the industry opened its doors to African American pilots and instructors, the club members began working at other airfields in the area. During that time, Green and other Cloud members would train the next generation of pilots.